In today's math video, we're going to be learning all there is to know about the quadrilateral. So by the end of this video today, you can say to yourself, I have mastered the goal of being able to identify and classify the different types of quadrilaterals. Alright, so let's review our vocabulary as we always do in these videos. First of all, congruent means that either the angles or the side measures have the same value. So we either have equal sides or equal angle measurements. Parallel versus perpendicular. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Pairs versus sets, vertices, and the different markings. Alright, so let's start out. What is a quadrilateral? A quadrilateral is a four-sided shape. Remember in the other day's video, we broke down the word triangle, and we said that the root word tri, T-R-I, meant that there were three, and the last part of the word angle, well, we know what angles are, so the word triangle made sense that it meant three angles. Well, quadrilateral, you can kind of do the same thing. The base word quad means four, and lateral means the words sides. So quad, four, lateral sides. A quadrilateral is a four-sided shape. Pretty neat, right? Alright, we have many types of quadrilaterals. We have a rectangle, we have a rhombus, we have a square, we have a trapezoid, a kite, and we also have a parallelogram. Let's start out with the old faithful rectangle. So a rectangle is a shape that has two sets of equal sides. Now, I want to bring you back to the vocabulary section at the very beginning. We said sets versus pairs. Okay. A pair. I want you to think for a second when your teacher tells you you can work in a pair. A pair is you and someone else. So a pair is two. So if I'm saying a pair of sides, I'm saying 1, 2. This would be a pair of sides. If I'm saying two sets of pairs, this could be a side, this could be a side, these two would make a pair, these two would make a pair. Altogether, I have two sets of pairs. Okay? Just to get that vocabulary out of the way so you know what I'm talking about when I say sets and pairs. Okay, so in a rectangle, first of all, in the vertices of the shape, they create right angles. So in all four corners of the rectangle, they create a right angle. Now, the sides. In a rectangle, there's usually two long sides and then two short sides. The two long sides are congruent, which means they have the same length, and the two short sides are congruent, so they have the same length. You might notice these little markings right here. These markings are really important to pay attention to because they are going to tell you if this is really and truly a rectangle. Now, when I have one tick mark here, usually you'll find the other one on the opposite side. One tick mark means that these are congruent, or they have the same measure. Two tick marks means that these two sides are congruent, or they have the same measures. So I would look to pair up the tick marks that were the same. So one tick mark with one, two with two. I wouldn't say that this one tick mark and these two tick marks are congruent. I only am looking at the ones with the same. So, rectangle has four right angles, two sets of congruent sides. One set, two set. Alright, the rhombus. Now, the rhombus, to me, is always like a slanted square. If you think about a square has all the same side measures, okay? That means that all four of those sides are the same exact measure. So if this side was 4 centimeters, all 4 of these sides would be 4 centimeters. Now imagine if you took that square and you pushed down on it so it kind of sunk a little to the side. That's what I imagine a rhombus looking like. Now, in a rhombus, same thing. All 4 of the sides are congruent. So just like in a square, if this side was 4 centimeters, all 4 of these sides would be 4 centimeters. You'll notice in a square we create those right angles in the corner. In a rhombus we do not. In a rhombus I have 2 acute angles and 2 obtuse angles. Because remember we said it's like you're squishing the square. So the main difference between a square and a rhombus is the angles. I don't create right angles in a rhombus. Okay, back to the square. So remember the square has all 4 equal sides and it creates right angles in the corner. The difference between the square and the rectangle is that the rectangle has 2 sets of congruent sides. The square has all congruent sides. So remember, rectangle looks like this. These 2 are equal and these 2 are equal. In a square, all 4 are equal. But the thing they have in common is the angles. They all create right angles in their vertices. Okay, next we have the parallelogram. Remember how we talked about how a square was like a rhombus was like a squished sideways square? A parallelogram is like a squished sideways rectangle. So if you can imagine a rectangle, drawing him up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So a rectangle has 2 sets of congruent sides, the long ones and the short ones. Same thing with parallelogram. You just push down on it and squish it a little to the side. This one has 2 sets of congruent sides, long ones and short ones. And similar to a rhombus, I have 2 acute angles and 2 obtuse angles. So I don't make those right angles anymore like a rectangle because it's squished. But the parallelogram still has 2 sets of congruent sides. Note, this is so important, and we talked about this last week. Squares, rectangles, and rhombuses are all parallelograms. They all have 4 sides, and the only requirement to be a parallelogram is that you have 2 sets of congruent sides. A square has 2 sets of congruent sides. A rectangle has 2 sets of congruent sides. And a rhombus has 2 sets of congruent sides. So all of these 3 shapes are all considered parallelograms. Alright, the trapezoid, my favorite shape. The trapezoid doesn't follow any rules except for one. The trapezoid is the only one that says you only need 1 pair of parallel lines. Other than that, there's no requirements of a trapezoid. Trapezoid can have anything on this side as long as these 2 sides are parallel. And remember, parallel means that they're the same distance apart. And so these lines could go on forever and they would never, ever touch. These ones, you don't really care. But the top 2, those ones always have to stay the same. Trapezoids can take many different shapes. Okay? Trapezoids can sometimes look like this. Trapezoids can also look like this. The most important thing to remember is that there is only 1 set of parallel lines. That's the only requirement. And so back to our markings. Remember, if you see a marking that looks like this, a little arrow, that means that those 2 sides are parallel. Alright, let's talk about the kite. Now, we don't normally hear the kite mentioned very often when we talk about quadrilaterals, but it is a 4-sided shape, and it is a very regular 4-sided shape. So, the kite has 2 sets of congruent sides. Instead of them being across from each other, like in the square and the rectangle and the rhombus and the parallelogram, instead they're kind of the opposite. The top 2 sides right here are congruent. So these have the same measures. The bottom two sides are congruent. They have the same two measures, different from the top. In the corners of the kite, they make all different kinds of angles. These two make obtuse, these two make acute, but the really funny thing about the kite is that if you draw a big cross in the middle, or if you were going to fold the kite in half and then in half the other way, they always make right angles in the center. So there's a right angle all the way across here. All right, my friends, it is now time to show what you know. Go to Canvas and show what you have learned about quadrilaterals. Good luck, and I hope you took great notes.